When you picture a prehistoric giant, what do you see? Perhaps it is the shadow of Tyrannosaurus, its footsteps shaking the earth. Perhaps it is the gentle, armored bulk of a Triceratops, or the impossible neck of a Brachiosaurus reaching into the canopy. These are the icons of a lost world, the undisputed rulers of the Mesozoic. Their names are legend, but we are mistaken. We believe their age was the first age of monsters. We believe they rose to rule an empty world, but the truth is far stranger. Long before the first true dinosaur ever walked the earth, millions of years before there was another time, another world, an age ruled by giants so bizarre, so alien, they seem pulled from a fever dream. This is the story of the world before the dinosaurs. To find it, we must journey back, not 200 million years, but 270 million years, to the heart of the Permian period. And we must visit a place that no longer exists. Pangaea. Forget the tidy, colourful shapes you learned in school. Pangaea was not just a concept. It was a real place. A single, colossal landmass that stretched from the North Pole to the South Pole, holding nearly all of Earth's land in one unbroken expanse. It was a world without the familiar boundaries of our oceans. A planet defined by a single continent and a single, globe-spanning sea called Panthalassa. And this world was brutal. The sheer size of Pangaea created a climate of extremes that our planet has not seen since. At its very centre lay an interior desert so vast it may have been the largest in Earth's history. A sun-scorched, arid heartland thousands of kilometres from the nearest drop of ocean moisture, where summers burned and winters brought freezing cold. Yet, on its fringes, life endured. The coastlines were battered by unimaginable storms, megamonsoons that lashed the continent for months at a time, feeding dense, humid jungles and swamps that clung to the edges of the land. This was a world of violent contrasts. And in this crucible of fire, ice, and water, evolution conducted its strangest experiments. This world was not ruled by reptiles as we know them. It was ruled by a different dynasty, a group of creatures known as Synapsids. They are often called mammal-like reptiles, but that name fails to capture their strangeness. They were not lizards, they were not mammals, they were something in between, a sprawling family of evolutionary pioneers who, by chance, belonged to the same lineage that would, hundreds of millions of years later, lead to us. For nearly 60 million years, they were the masters of Pangaea. They were the apex predators. They were the armored herbivores. They filled every niche, from tiny burrowers to saber-toothed hunters, and they were, without question, the strangest creatures that have ever lived. They were beasts with tiny heads on massive, barrel-shaped bodies. They were tanks covered in bony armour. They were hunters with sails on their backs, and they were killers with skulls thicker than concrete. These are the forgotten rulers of Earth. Their reign was absolute until it was brought to an end by an apocalypse so profound it nearly sterilized the entire planet. Their extinction is the only reason the dinosaurs had a world to inherit. Tonight, we journey back to this lost age. We will walk the alien landscapes of Pangaea, breathe its forgotten air, and meet the true, original giants of our planet. Before we meet the creatures, we must first understand the world that built them. For no life is separate from its environment, and the environment of Pangaea was the most extreme our planet has ever produced. It was a world forged from a single, unbroken piece of rock. The scale is almost impossible to comprehend. When all land is one, distance itself changes meaning. To stand in the centre of Pangaea was to be isolated on a level that no longer exists. You would be surrounded by land in every direction, a continent so vast that you could walk for 1,000 kilometres, and then 1,000 more, and the horizon would still just be more land. The nearest ocean, the Great Panthalassa, was a journey of months or even years across an endless continental interior. This single geographic fact, the sheer, overwhelming size of the landmass, created a climate of profound violence. Today, our world is fragmented. Oceans weave between continents, acting as the planet's great circulatory system. They absorb heat, they release it slowly, and their currents carry moisture and mild temperatures deep into the hearts of our lands. Our weather is tempered by this constant exchange of energy between water and rock. Pangaea had no such balance. It was a world defined by a single, global ocean, and a single, dominant continent. The heart of Pangaea was a desert. But this was not a desert in any modern sense. It was not the Sahara, nor the Gobi, nor the Atacama. It was a continental interior arid zone so vast it likely dwarfs them all combined. This was the Great Interior, a region so far removed from the ocean that rain simply could not reach it. The winds that blew from Pangaea, thousands of kilometers away, would have shed every last drop of moisture on the coastlines, long before they ever reached this inner world. What was left was dry, thin air, sweeping across a landscape of baked earth, salt flats, and endless dunes. Geologists today find the footprint of this place in thick, widespread layers of red rock and massive salt deposits, the tombstones of evaporated seas, buried deep within the continents that once formed Pangaea's core. Life here was not impossible, but it was perched on the edge of oblivion. Hardy, drought-resistant conifers and tough, leathery ferns clung to life along the banks of ephemeral rivers, waterways that might flow with furious power for a few weeks a year, only to vanish back into cracked mud and dust. But the defining feature of this climate was not just its dryness, it was its volatility. Without the moderating blanket of ocean humidity, the land was a slave to the sun. The summers were not just hot, they were relentless, scorching affairs where surface temperatures could have reached levels lethal to much of modern life. The sun would beat down from a cloudless sky, baking the red soil until the air itself shimmered, and the nights, in turn, were bitterly cold. All the day's heat would radiate away instantly into the clear, dry sky, plunging the desert into a deep freeze. This was a land of brutal, whiplashing extremes, a place of fire and ice every 24 hours. Yet, this was only half the story. If the interior was a world of stillness and drought, the coastlines were a world of chaos and deluge. The same imbalance that starved the interior created a different monster on the edges of the continent. Climatologists who model this ancient world have a name for the weather system that dominated Pangaea, the megamonsoon. In summer, the vast, superheated interior desert would act like a global chimney, its hot air rising and creating a low-pressure void of continental scale. This void didn't just pull in air, it inhaled the ocean. Massive, moisture-saturated winds would be drawn in from Pangaea, slamming into the coastlines of Pangaea. This was not rain as we know it. This was a seasonal deluge that may have lasted for months. The skies would open, and water would fall in catastrophic amounts, drowning the coastal plains, feeding colossal river systems that carved their way hundreds of kilometers inland. These monsoons brought life. They fed lush, dense swamps and humid forests that exploded with growth, teeming with amphibians, insects, and the first great reptiles. But in winter, the cycle reversed. The vast interior, now freezing under a distant sun, became a high-pressure zone. Cold, dry air would pour outwards from the heart of the continent, pushing the moisture back, starving the coasts, and bringing a sudden, harsh, dry season. Life on Pangaea was therefore a life of all or nothing. You either endured months of torrential, flooding rain followed by months of parching drought on the coasts, or you endured the blistering heat and freezing cold of the deep interior. There was no mild zone. There was no gentle, temperate world. There was only the furnace and the flood. This is the world that built the creatures of the Permian. This is the crucible that forged them. The bizarre forms we are about to meet were not evolutionary accidents. They were answers. They were solutions to questions posed by a planet of extremes. When you have a world this harsh, evolution does not favor subtlety. It favors radical design. It demands bodies that can store water for months. It demands sails to act as living radiators. It demands armor to protect against desperate predators in a land of scarce resources. It demands massive, fermenting guts to extract every last nutrient from the toughest, driest plants. The giants of Pangaea were not strange just to be strange. They were strange because their world demanded nothing less. They were the children of the megamonsoon, the masters of the great interior, and their reign was absolute until the planet itself changed the rules. We begin our journey not in the scorched, arid heart of the supercontinent, but on its volatile, life-giving margins. Here, in the early Permian, roughly 290 million years ago, the megamonsoons define reality. These are lands of water, vast, humid swamps, and sprawling river deltas that glitter between dense forests of tree ferns and early conifers. The air is thick, heavy with moisture, and the smell of wet earth and decay. And through these wetlands stalks the first great land predator our planet had ever seen. Its name is Dimetrodon. It is, perhaps, the most famous creature on our list. Its silhouette is iconic, a staple of childhood dinosaur toys, instantly recognizable. And yet, this is the first and most fundamental truth we must understand. Dimetrodon was not a dinosaur. It wasn't even a true reptile. It belonged to an entirely different branch of the tree of life. It was a pelycosaur, a member of that dominant synapsid lineage. This creature, with its sprawling legs and seemingly primitive form, was, in the grand story of evolution, a distant cousin. It was, impossibly, more closely related to us than it was to a Tyrannosaurus rex, but it was no mammal. It was a master of its own time, an evolutionary experiment that ruled the swamps of Pangaea for over 20 million years. Its body was a contradiction of power and primitive design. It was large, some species stretching over 3.5 meters, 11 feet long, and weighing as much as a modern tiger. It moved with a low, sprawling gait, its legs held out to the side of its body in a powerful, reptilian waddle. This was not a creature built for pursuit. It was built for ambush. Its head was massive, narrow, and deep, filled with a terrifying array of teeth. In fact, its name, Dimetrodon, means 2 measures of teeth. Unlike the simple, peg-like teeth of most reptiles, it had a differentiated set. Long, sharp, saber-like stabbing teeth at the front of its jaw, and smaller, shearing teeth further back. This was a sophisticated toolkit for a predator, designed to seize, pierce, and tear through the tough hides of its prey creatures like the giant amphibian Eriops or the large, freshwater sharks that shared its watery kingdom. But all of this pales in comparison to the feature that defines it. The sail, rising from its spine, was an extraordinary structure of skin, stretched between long, thin neural spines, some extending over 1 meter high. This was not armor. It was a delicate, intricate, and biologically expensive billboard. For decades, its purpose was a mystery, but today, we believe it was a key to Dimetrodon's dominance. Its primary function was likely thermoregulation. It was a living solar panel. In the harsh, volatile climate of Pangaea, this was a critical advantage. Dimetrodon was, like all creatures of its time, cold-blooded. In the cool, misty mornings of the Permian swamps, its competitors would be sluggish, their bodies slow to absorb the day's warmth. But not Dimetrodon. By simply turning its massive sail broadside to the first rays of the sun, it could absorb solar radiation at a rapid rate. Its blood, circulating through the thousands of vessels within the sail, would warm up in minutes, not hours. It could raise its body temperature by several degrees, while its prey was still shaking off the night's chill. It was a metabolic head start. It could be active, alert, and hunting, while the rest of its world was still waking up. Conversely, in the crushing heat of the afternoon, the sail worked in reverse. A simple turn into the wind, or a retreat into the shade, and the same structure would radiate heat away, cooling the animal's massive body and preventing it from overheating. In a world of violent temperature swings, Dimetrodon had evolved its own climate control, but this was likely not its only use. Such a vibrant, visible structure almost certainly served as a method of display. Like the feathers of a peacock or the antlers of a stag, the sail was a signal. A larger, more brightly coloured sail may have signalled a healthy, dominant male, intimidating rivals or attracting mates. It was a statement of power, visible from a distance across the flat, swampy terrain. For 20 million years, this creature was the undisputed king of its domain. It was the largest carnivore on land, a perfect marriage of primitive power and sophisticated adaptation. It was a synapsid success story, one of the first to truly claim the title of apex predator. But its reign, like the coastal swamps it patrolled, was not forever. As the Permian wore on, the climate of Pangaea began to change. The world was slowly, imperceptibly, getting drier. The great swamps began to recede. Dimetrodon, a creature so perfectly tied to the water's edge, faded with them. It was an early king, a pioneer of the Synapsid dynasty. But it was just the beginning. As the humid coasts gave way to the tougher, more arid interior of the supercontinent, evolution would be forced to invent even stranger solutions. The sail-backed king would be replaced by a new generation of giants, built not for the swamp, but for the desert. As we leave the wet, swampy kingdom of Dimetrodon and move inland, the world changes. The air grows thinner and drier. The dense, humid forests of the coast begin to thin, giving way to vast, open plains dotted with hardy conifers and tough, low-growing ferns. We are entering the semi-arid lands that border the great interior, a world defined less by water and more by the relentless sun. Life in this environment faces a different set of challenges. The vegetation is sparse, fibrous, and difficult to digest. To survive here, you cannot be a swift, opportunistic hunter. You must be a specialist. You must be a living furnace, a creature built to extract every last calorie from the poorest of resources. And it is here, in these unforgiving landscapes, that we meet one of the most visually absurd creatures in the history of life. Its name is Cotylorhynchus, and it is, perhaps, the ultimate evolutionary experiment in making do. The first impression is one of profound imbalance. It is a creature that seems to defy the very laws of biological engineering. The body is colossal, an enormous, barrel-shaped torso so wide and deep it looks inflated. This was not fat. It was a gut, a vast, complex fermentation vat that stretched for meters, supported by a reinforced ribcage and sturdy, sprawling limbs. This body, weighing up to 2 tons, was a biological processing plant, a testament to the sheer difficulty of surviving on Permian-era plants. And then, perched at the very front of this mountainous body, is the head. It is impossibly, almost comically, small. A tiny, triangular skull, no larger than that of a medium-sized dog, sits atop a neck that seems wholly incapable of supporting the animal it belongs to. The head seems like an afterthought, a biological necessity tacked onto a creature that is, for all practical purposes, a walking digestive system. This bizarre anatomy was its key to survival. Cotylorhynchus was a caseid pelycosaur, a distant relative of the predator Dimetrodon. But its lineage had taken a radical turn. It had committed itself fully to herbivory in one of the toughest environments on Earth. The plants it ate, seed ferns, cycads, and tough conifers, were low in nutrients and incredibly high in fiber. They were the kind of vegetation that most animals simply could not process. Cotylorhynchus solved this problem with sheer scale. It would have spent its entire day lumbering slowly across the plains, using its small, peg-like teeth not to chew, but to rake and crop vegetation, swallowing it whole. From there, the food would enter the enormous gut, where it would remain for days, possibly even weeks. Inside this internal bioreactor, a complex soup of symbiotic microbes would slowly break down the tough cellulose, fermenting the plant matter and releasing the nutrients the animal so desperately needed. Its entire life was dedicated to this slow, constant process of eating and fermenting. Its small head was a marvel of efficiency. It was just large enough to house the cropping teeth, the nostrils, and the tiny brain required to operate its massive body. A larger head would have been a waste of resources, an unnecessary burden on an animal that had streamlined every part of its existence purely for digestion. Its posture was just as strange. Its limbs, though thick, were still held in a primitive, sprawling gait. This meant that its huge, barrel-shaped belly would have hung low, perhaps even dragging along the ground as it walked. It would have moved with a slow, ponderous, side-to-side motion, a living mountain of flesh inching its way across the dusty plains. This was not a creature of grace or speed. It was a creature of persistence. Its bulk was its primary defense. In a world with predators like Dimetrodon still patrolling the riverbeds, Cotylorhynchus was simply too large, too round, and too leathery for most hunters to bother with. It was the Permian equivalent of a boulder slow, solid, and almost entirely self-contained. It represents a pinnacle of Permian strangeness. Evolution, faced with the challenge of a dry world and poor quality food, produced this. A creature that prioritized its stomach above all else. It is a powerful reminder that in the game of survival, success does not always go to the swift or the sharp. Sometimes it goes to the patient, the efficient, and the profoundly, unbelievably bizarre. The existence of Cotylorhynchus paints a vivid picture of the world it lived in. It tells us that life was tough, that resources were scarce, and that survival demanded radical, specialized solutions. But this creature, this walking fermentation tank, was not the only experiment evolution was running on the synapsid line. In other parts of Pangaea, another group was taking a different approach to survival, not by growing a bigger gut, but by growing a thicker skull. If Cotylorhynchus was an evolutionary experiment in passive digestion, a creature that simply endured its world, Pangaea was simultaneously running a far more violent experiment. As we move across the same semi-arid plains of the middle Permian, we find another group of synapsids that took a different path. They were not focused on their guts, they were focused on their heads. We meet Moscops. This creature belonged to a group known as the Dinosaurs, a name that perfectly translates to terrible heads, and it was a title they had thoroughly earned. Moschops itself was a giant, a lumbering herbivore that could stand over 2.5 meters, over 8 feet tall, and weigh well over a ton. It was a beast of sheer bulk, built to move across the tough, open landscapes of what would one day become the Karoo Basin in South Africa. But its size was not its most defining feature. Its strangeness, and the key to its life, was its skull. The bone of its forehead was incredibly, abnormally thick. In some specimens, this solid, reinforced mass of bone, a feature called pachyostosis, was over 10 centimeters, 4 inches thick. It was a living battering ram, a helmet of solid bone integrated directly into its skeleton, with a complex internal structure designed to absorb and dissipate massive kinetic energy. Why develop such a costly, heavy, and bizarre adaptation? For an animal living in a harsh, resource-scarce environment, every biological feature must pay for itself. A thick skull offered some protection, certainly, but this was overkill. The answer, paleontologists believe, was not defense against predators. It was violence against its own kind. We must imagine Moschops not as a solitary animal, but as a complex social creature, moving in herds across the dusty plains of Pangaea. And in any herd, there is hierarchy. There is competition. In a world defined by scarcity, a good patch of vegetation or a reliable, shrinking waterhole was worth fighting for, and even more valuable was the right to pass on your genes. Moschops likely settled these disputes in the most direct way possible. Brutal, high-impact, head-to-head combat. Modern animals like musk oxen or bighorn sheep give us a living preview of this behavior. We can picture two rival Moschops males facing each other, perhaps displaying, perhaps bellowing in the dry Permian air, and then they would charge. The sound of two of these creatures colliding, a ton of muscle and bone meeting a ton of muscle and bone, with all that impact focused on their cranial battering rams, must have echoed for miles across the otherwise silent landscape. This was a contest of sheer, concussive force. The winner, the one with the thicker skull, the stronger neck, and the sheer endurance to withstand the blows, would win the right to mate. It was a life of ritualized violence. The terrible head was a weapon, an advertisement of strength, and a key to genetic survival, all forged into one anatomical structure. This behavior was a direct response to their world. Living in a herd offered protection from the predators that were beginning to emerge on these plains. But social living created its own internal pressures. The skull of Moschops was an adaptation that allowed this competition to be mediated, establishing a pecking order without necessarily killing the loser. It was a specialized tool for a specialized social life. Beyond this cranial weapon, Moschops was a powerful herbivore. Like Cotylorhynchus, it had a deep, barrel-shaped body to house a large gut for fermenting tough plants. But unlike its sprawling relative, Moschops held its legs more directly underneath its body. This more advanced posture suggests it was a more active and mobile creature. It had to be. It had to travel long distances between feeding grounds, and it had to be strong and stable enough to power its cranial weapon. The Dinosaurs, with Moschops as one of their most prominent members, represented a hugely successful and aggressive branch of the Synapsid family. They were not passive survivors. They were active competitors. They took the innate harshness of Pangaea and reflected it in their own violent, head-butting behavior. But this evolutionary arms race, herbivores growing larger, stronger, and tougher, did not go unanswered. Life on Pangaea was an intricate network of pressures. As these herbivores evolved new ways to fight each other, they also had to contend with the predators that hunted them. And in a world of giants, a thick skull designed for ritual combat might be useless against a hunter. To survive the other threat, evolution would need to invent a different kind of solution. It would need to build a fortress. In the great, violent theatre of Pangaea, not every creature evolved to fight back. The strategy of the Moskops to meet force with greater force was just one path. For others, survival was not about winning a fight. It was about making the fight not worth the effort. As we move across the same late Permian landscapes, we encounter another evolutionary masterpiece. A creature that abandoned the idea of active combat and instead turned itself into a living fortress. We meet Scutosaurus, the shield lizard. It belonged to a group called the Dinosaurs, a successful and widespread family of herbivores that represented a different answer to the pressures of their world. Scutosaurus was enormous. It was roughly the size of a modern hippopotamus, a 3-meter, 10-foot-long, 1-ton behemoth of muscle and bone. Like the other herbivores of its time, its body was a deep, wide barrel designed for processing tough vegetation, and its head was, by comparison, remarkably small. But it was the skin of this creature that made it extraordinary. This was not the soft hide of an elephant or the scaly covering of a lizard. The skin of Scutosaurus was a dense, armored tapestry. Embedded directly within its dermis were thousands of bony plates, knobs, and studs. These were osteoderms, the same biological armor that we see today in crocodiles and armadillos. But on a massive scale, it was a suit of biological chainmail, a flexible, near-impenetrable coat that covered its entire back, flanks, and neck. This was not a shell, like a turtle's, which is a fused, rigid box. This was a dynamic, living defense. The bony scutes made its hide incredibly difficult to puncture, a shield against the teeth and claws of the new predators that were beginning to stalk these lands. Scutosaurus was a walking tank. Its legs were thick, pillar-like columns, though still held in a semi-sprawling posture, designed to support its immense weight. It was not built for speed. It could not outrun anything. Its entire evolutionary strategy was based on the simple premise that it did not have to. Its life would have been a slow, ponderous search for food. Moving in herds, these creatures would have browsed on the low-lying, fibrous plants of the semi-arid plains. Their small heads, armed with simple, leaf-shaped teeth, were just tools for cropping, gathering the fuel for the large fermenting gut that did the real work. They were the great lawnmowers of the late Permian. We must picture them as Moskops' neighbors. Where Moschops was a creature of ritualized violence and internal conflict, Scutosaurus was a creature of passive endurance. When a threat appeared on the horizon, the herd's response would have been simple. Hunker down. They would have clustered together, presenting a wall of armored hide, their small, protected heads tucked low. This adaptation tells us something profound about the world Scutosaurus lived in. This level of defense is not evolved by accident. Such heavy armor is biologically expensive. It takes enormous energy to grow, and even more energy to carry. You do not develop a shield unless you are expecting a sword. The existence of Scutosaurus is the ultimate proof that the predators of Pangaea were becoming larger, more powerful, and more sophisticated. The sheer bulk of Cotylorhynchus was no longer a deterrent. The aggressive posturing of Moschops was no longer a guarantee of safety. A new kind of killer was on the loose. This was the great evolutionary arms race of the Permian. As herbivores evolved thicker skulls and armored hides, the predators, in turn, were evolving new weapons to defeat them. This back and forth, this deadly dance of adaptation and counter-adaptation, was accelerating, and as Scutosaurus perfected its passive defense, turning itself into an almost invulnerable fortress, evolution was preparing its counter-move. It was creating a monster designed to hunt monsters. A creature that would not be deterred by armor, a creature that evolved the ultimate weapon to puncture the shield. For all its defenses, Scutosaurus was prey, and the creature that hunted it would become the true, undisputed tyrant of late Permian Pangaea. The Permian arms race had reached a fever pitch. On one side, herbivores had evolved into walking fortresses like Scutosaurus, clad in bony armor, and living tanks like Moschops, armed with thickened skulls. These were creatures built to endure, to resist, and to intimidate. But evolution is a relentless dialogue. For every shield, it designs a sword, and the sword that evolved to break the Permian defenses was a masterpiece of biological terror. As we stand on the same vast, semi-arid plains of the late Permian, a new shadow falls. It is faster than Dimetrodon, it is smarter, and it is infinitely more lethal. This is the apex predator of its world, the creature that hunted the giants. This is the Gorgonopsid. The name means Gorgon face, a reference to the horrifying monsters of Greek myth. It was a name well earned. These were not a single species, but a family of hunters that represented the pinnacle of synapsid predatory design. The largest among them, like Inostrancevia, from what is now Russia, were the size of a large bear, with a skull nearly 60 centimeters, 2 feet long. This was the wolf, the lion, and the saber-toothed cat of its age, all rolled into one. And it was a synapsid, a mammal-like creature, but one that had taken a path of pure, specialized carnage. Its entire body was a weapon. The first, most revolutionary change was its posture. Unlike the sprawling, waddling gait of Dimetrodon or Cotylorhynchus, the Gorgonopsid's legs were positioned underneath its body. This was a critical evolutionary leap. It allowed for a more efficient, upright stride. It could walk, trot, and perhaps even gallop for short bursts. It was no longer a creature bound to the swamp's edge. It was an active, mobile hunter, capable of covering the vast distances of Pangaea's open plains. But its true terror lay in its head. The skull was a lightweight, reinforced frame of bone and muscle, built for a single, devastating purpose. And at the front of that skull, housed in its upper jaw, were the weapons that defined it. These were not the conical, crushing teeth of a Tyrannosaurus. They were daggers. In a large Inostrancevia, these teeth could be 12 centimeters, nearly 5 inches long, flattened from side to side, and sometimes finely serrated like a steak knife. They were not designed to crush bone. They were designed to shear through flesh. The Gorgonopsid was a specialist. It hunted the massive, thick-skinned herbivores that shared its world, the Scutosaurus and the Moskops, and it had evolved the perfect tools for the job. We must picture the hunt. It is dusk on the Permian plain. A herd of Scutosaurus grazes nervously, their armored bodies clustered for protection. They are a wall of osteoderms and hide, seemingly invulnerable, but the Gorgonopsid does not see an invulnerable wall. It sees a fortress with 1,000 gaps. It would have stalked the herd with patience, its long, powerful body low to the ground. Its senses, good eyesight, a keen sense of smell, would have been locked on its target. It was not looking for the strongest. It was looking for the weak, the old, the straggler. Then the attack. An explosion of speed that would have shocked its prey. The Gorgonopsid would charge, its powerful limbs propelling it forward, closing the distance in seconds. It would bypass the armored back and the thick-skulled head. It was aiming for the weak points, the soft, vulnerable underbelly, or the exposed, artery-rich neck. It would have used its powerful forelimbs to grapple, to hold on for just a moment, and then the killing blow. The jaw would open incredibly wide, perhaps over 90 degrees, to clear the saber teeth. The strike would be a deep, powerful stab, driven by the muscles of the neck and jaw, plunging the twin daggers deep into the flesh of the Scutosaurus. The purpose was not to hold on. The purpose was to inflict a single, catastrophic wound. The teeth would slice through muscle and sever major blood vessels. Then the Gorgonopsid would release, leaping back out of range of the dying animal's weight, and it would simply wait. The armored giant, its defenses made useless, would bleed out in minutes. For millions of years, this was the balance of power on Pangaea. The Gorgonopsids were the undisputed masters. They were the engine of fear that drove their prey to evolve ever thicker armor and ever stronger skulls. They were the pinnacle of a 60 million year dynasty. They seemed invincible. They had speed, power, intelligence, and a weapon that nothing could counter. They were the ultimate expression of life in the Permian. But the arms race between hunter and hunted, this intricate dance of adaptation that had defined an entire era, was about to be rendered utterly, instantly, and completely meaningless. The reign of the Gorgonopsid was coming to an end. Not by a new competitor, not by a changing climate, but by an apocalypse. The planet itself was about to strike back. And a new kind of strangest creature was waiting in the wings, not the strongest, but the one that would inherit a world of ash. While the titans of the Permian, the armored Scutosaurus, and the saber-toothed Gorgonopsid were locked in their evolutionary war, another creature was quietly moving through the undergrowth. It was not a giant. It was not an apex predator. It was, by all appearances, completely unremarkable. Its name was Lystrosaurus. It was about the size of a pig, a stocky, four-legged animal with a short, blunt snout. It had no armor, no sail, and no terrifying claws. Its only notable features were a turtle-like beak for clipping plants and two small, downward-pointing tusks. It was a dicynodont, a member of the Synapsid family, but it was a humble representative. It was a generalist, a simple herbivore that likely spent its days grubbing for roots, tubers, and tough stems. In a world ruled by the terrifying and the bizarre, Lystrosaurus was a creature of the margins. It was a background player. It was prey, and in the normal course of evolution, it would have eventually faded into obscurity, just another strange footnote in the long history of Pangaea. But the course of evolution was about to be stopped. All the adaptations we have seen, the sails, the thick skulls, the armor, the saber teeth, were solutions to the problems of the Permian, but they were useless against the problem that was coming. Around 252 million years ago, the ground in what is now Siberia tore open. This was not a single volcanic eruption. It was a geological event on a scale that defies imagination. The Siberian Traps. For nearly 1 million years, a flood of magma so vast it could have buried the entire United States under a kilometer of molten rock poured onto the surface of Pangaea. But the lava was the least of the dangers. The eruptions released a catastrophic payload of gas into the atmosphere. Trillions of tons of carbon dioxide, methane, and sulfur dioxide choked the sky. The effects were immediate and total. The greenhouse gases triggered runaway global warming, sending temperatures soaring. The sulfur dioxide mixed with water to create global acid rain, stripping the land of its plants. The oceans, absorbing the CO2, became acidic and were poisoned, suffocating marine life and dissolving the shells of countless creatures. The air itself became toxic, depleted of oxygen. It is known as the Great Dying. It was the most profound extinction event in the history of life. 96% of all marine species vanished. 70% of all terrestrial vertebrate life was wiped from existence. The Gorgonopsids, the invincible masters of their world, were gone. The armored Scutosaurus, their fortresses useless against a sky that was burning and suffocating them, were gone. The Moschops, the Cotylorhynchus, all gone. The entire 60 million year dynasty of the great Synapsids was, in a geological instant, terminated. Almost. In the ash-choked, superheated, low-oxygen wasteland of the early Triassic, something stirred. Why this creature? Why the humble, pig-sized herbivore and not the titans? The answer, it seems, lies in its unremarkable life. While the giants lived and died on the surface, Lystrosaurus could dig. When the air became poison and the sun became a furnace, it could retreat underground, sealing itself in a pocket of survivable air. Its physiology, too, may have been uniquely suited to the disaster. Its lungs, possibly already adapted to the stale, low-oxygen environment of a burrow, were better equipped to handle the poisoned atmosphere. Its generalist diet of tough roots and stems meant it could find food where the lush forests had been burned away. When it emerged, it inherited an empty planet. Its predators were gone. Its competitors were gone. And here, we find the strangest fact of all. In the immediate aftermath of the Great Dying, Lystrosaurus wasn't just a survivor. It was the survivor. Fossil beds from the early Triassic show a haunting, almost unbelievable reality. In many parts of the recovering Pangaea, nearly 90% of all four-legged vertebrates on Earth was a Lystrosaurus. This is its true strangeness. Not its beak, not its tusks, but its sheer, overwhelming, lonely dominance. It was the unlikeliest king, ruling over a kingdom of graveyards. The dynasty was over. The 60 million year reign of the great Synapsids had been extinguished not by a superior competitor, but by the planet's own internal fire. The sail-backed kings, the barrel-bodied giants, the armored fortresses, and the saber-toothed tyrants, all of them were erased, their evolutionary experiments cut short, their lineages terminated forever. The world that emerged from the ash was a ghost of its former self. Pangaea, once teeming with these strange and terrible beasts, was now an empty stage. For millions of years, the humble Lystrosaurus wandered this broken land, a lonely monarch ruling a kingdom of silence. This event, the Great Dying, was the most important reset button in the history of life. It was a complete and total wiping of the slate. The extinction of the synapsid giants created the single greatest power vacuum the world has ever known. And in this empty, quiet world, another group of survivors, animals that had spent millions of years living in the shadows of the synapsid rulers, finally found their chance. These were the archosaurs, small, agile reptiles. They too had endured the apocalypse, their small bodies and efficient metabolisms allowing them to scrape by where the giants had starved. Before the extinction, the synapsids, our distant relatives, were the dominant force. They were on the path to ruling the world. But the Great Dying cut that lineage off at the knees. The line that led to us was reduced to a few tiny, shrew-like burrowers, forced back into the darkness. But the line of the archosaurs, newly freed from competition, exploded. In the empty niches left by the Gorgonopsids and the moschops, these small reptiles began to experiment. They evolved, they grew larger, they adapted, and from this desperate, opportunistic radiation, a new dynasty was born, the first dinosaurs. This is the ultimate legacy of the forgotten giants of Pangaea. Their lives were a testament to evolution's bizarre creativity, but their deaths are the reason for the world we know. Their extinction is the only reason we have an age of dinosaurs. We have journeyed through a lost world and met creatures that truly defy our modern imagination. From the sail-backed Dimetrodon to the absurd Cotylohynchus, or the terrifying Gorgonopsid, which of these forgotten rulers do you find the most bizarre? We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for joining us on this journey back in time.